سلام به همه دوستان عزیزی که روی لایو اینستاگرام حاضر شدن در صفحه کانون معماران معاصر. امروز در خدمتتون هستیم با یک لکچر دیگر از مجموعه لکچر سری‌های 2022 معماری معاصر از ماده تا انتزاع. من طبق معمول به 2 زبان معرفی میکنم مهمون رو اول و بعد از مقدمه لکچرمون ترجمه رو خواهم کرد. Okay, hello everyone and welcome. We are very honored today to have Edwardo here with us. Edwardo is an architect from Spain. He holds a master's in architecture with honors from the Polytechnic University of Madrid and a master's in architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. His work has been exhibited at the Biennale of Spanish Architecture and Urbanism, the 16th Venice Architecture Biennale, and the Colegio de Arquitectos de Madrid. He is a recipient of the 2019-20 inaugural Fishman Fellowship at the University of Michigan, 2018 KPF Travel Fellowship, the RCC Fellowship at Harvard University, and the Arthur Lehman Fund, and plus numerous awards additional to that recently. Eduardo has also taught and lectured at various universities, including University of Michigan Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, where he taught graduate and undergrad studios. He has previously taught at Pennsylvania State University, the Polytechnic University of Madrid, and the Harvard University Graduate School of Design summer program. Okay, let's translate. خب دوستان، امروز مهمون ما ادواردو مدیه رو هست از اسپانیا، معمار اسپانیایی که از دانشگاه پلی‌تکنیک مادرید با مدرک ممتاز فارغ التحصیل شد و همینطور از مدرک کارشناسی ارشد دارد از دانشگاه هاروارد. در 2 سالانه معماری و شهرسازی در اسپانیا و همینطور در ونیز کارش به نمایش گذاشته شده و کمک هزینه تحصیلی و فلوشیپ گرفته از دانشگاه میشیگان، هزینه تحصیلی KPF در سال 2018، کمک هزینه تحصیلی RCC و همینطور فلوشیپ از دانشگاه هاروارد. همینطور تجربه تدریس داره در دانشگاه‌های مختلف از جمله دانشگاه میشیگان، دانشگاه پنسیلوانیا، دانشگاه پلی‌تکنیک مادرید و همینطور برنامه تابستونی دانشگاه هاروارد. So I met Eduardo for the first time at Harvard GST where we both were studying. May be interesting for you to know that Eduardo had plans to visit Iran and study social housing projects in trends.This as a part of his fellowship, and we had some exchanges about his research back then in 2019. His trip to Iran never happened, however, he visited several other cities in the world and finally extended his research to his thesis project at the GST. Eduardo's interest in materiality on the one hand and digital media and contemporary representation on the other hand, I believe, makes his practice a fascinating case for us to investigate within the conceptual framework of our lecture series. من و ادواردو هم دیگر رو در دانشگاه هاروارد ملاقات کردیم اولین بار وقتی که هر دو تایمون دانشجو بودیم. ادواردو جالبه که بدونید در اون موقع حدود 3 سال پیش برنامه داشت که بیاد ایران و یک بخشی از تحقیقش برای فلوشیپش مسئله مسکن رو بررسی کنه و دوست داشت که در واقع تحقیقی در مورد مسکن جمعی در پردیس انجام بده. سفرش اتفاق نیفتاد ولی خب اون تحقیق رو ادامه داد و تبدیل به پروژه تزش شد در دانشگاه. و دلیل اینکه حالا ما ادواردو رو انتخاب کردیم برای این برنامه علاقش به یک نوع گرایش خاصی به مصالح و ماده و همزمان با علاقش به یک جور بازنمایی معاصر معماریه که حالا بیشتر در موردش صحبت میکنم. As you may remember from our introductory lecture about a month ago, or about 2 months ago, I believe, we are interested in the reciprocity between form and material in architecture. We looked at the 2 notions of material form on the one hand and formal matter on the other. همونطور که خاطر دارید از لکچر اولمون ما در واقع داریم به این 2 تا کانسپت فرمال ماتر و متریال فرم، ماده مصالح و مصالح مادی نگاه میکنیم. And I can detect this binary tension in Eduardo's work as well. و این رو من تو کار ادواردو هم گاهی میتونم ببینم. Going back to our diagram of form and materiality, perhaps we could locate the project called types of spaces on the top left corner, where we have an idealized or an almost Platonic composition of perfect types made with a haptic material. To the bottom left corner in a project called Garden House, where he's using raw material of a rock as a kitchen countertop. To the bottom right corner, where we see a model as a part of an exhibition series called Practice Product Protocol, where we can observe a playful, maybe post-digital representation of everyday types and objects. And finally, in the top right corner, in a project called Ronda House, when we see an abstract, an ideal representation of both form and materiality. So this diagram shows a more extensive, okay, let me translate this. و ما تو این دیاگرام فرم و مصالحمون اومدیم و در 4 موقعیتی که داریم 4 تا از کارهای ادواردو رو من گذاشتم، جایی که ما فرم ایدئال داریم از یک طرف و فرم رئال در بالا و پایین این دیاگرام، و سمت چپ مصالح طبیعی داریم و چیزی که اسمش terrestrial matter گذاشتم، و سمت راست مصالح انتزاعی یا transcendence materiality. So this diagram shows a more extensive selection of his works within our theoretical framework, touching different areas from haptic materiality versus optic idealism to terrestrial versus speculative realism. So as I mentioned before, locating Edwardo's work and the intersection of all these concepts makes his practice a fascinating case for us to study and learn more about. و همونطور که من قبلا گفتم، این که کارهای ادواردو رو حالا تو این دیاگرام بزرگترمون می‌بینیم که اینا اومدن و این گوشه‌های مختلف رو تاچ کردن، این خیلی برای موضوع این لکچر سری ما سلسله سخنرانی ما پرکتیس ادواردو رو جالب میکنه، دفتری که داره، و به همین دلیل دعوتش کردیم و بسیار مشتاق و کنجکاویم که بیشتر بشه. Stop here and invite you all to join me in welcoming Edwardo. Thank you, Edwardo, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Áren, for the intro, and interesting to see the work sort of placed in that diagram. I think we can expand on that a little later, but it's good. It's revealing. It sort of helps also direct the conversation. Let me share the screen. Thanks. And I'll be sort of keeping an eye on stopping every now and then for translation. But
that would be great.
Yeah, if I forget or ramble for too long, just put your hands up.
I will. Okay, thanks.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for joining, and thank you for the invites. It's a pleasure to be here, and again, as Áren was saying, I've had the interest in visiting Iran and learning more about the culture and the architecture there for quite some time, and I'm eager to travel and get to know you guys a little better in the years to come. The lectures is going to be structured in the following way. First, I'll be sort of introducing the practice, but more importantly, introducing sort of the context in which my practice hangar is operating, or the context in which we're working, and in order to illustrate how we respond to that context, both in terms of maybe material form or formal matter. I'll be showing just three projects, super direct, super simple, straight on, but maybe through the sort of directness of that work, maybe we can sort of unpack ideas later, and I'll be really eager to hear some thoughts or questions, or have a conversation afterwards.
Great, let me translate this. خب تشکر کرد در ابتدا. میگه که تشکر میکنم که منو دعوت کردین و خوشحالم که اینجا هستم و در مورد سفر به ایران که گفتین امیدوارم که این یک روزی دوباره اتفاق بیفته و من بتونم ببینم و در حقیقت اون تحقیقم رو ادامه بدم. و میگه که من کارهام رو در کانتکست یا در بستر پرکتیسی که دارم، پرکتیس هنگار که اسمش رو میبینید گوشه سمت چپ نوشته شده، تعریف میکنم و کارش رابطه مستقیمی داره با نوع شکلگیری شرکتش که در ادامه برای ما توضیح خواهد داد.
Great. Okay. So we're a 10-year-long architecture practice, and I'm saying this very clearly, precisely, right? Because there was something that when we launched our office almost a year and a half ago, we knew that we didn't want to sort of contribute to sort of this idea of never-ending architecture practice that is constantly sort of feeding the work in trying to be something larger, but actually having a shorter span in which we could actually critically look and decide what sort of work we would be doing in a limited sort of time span.
وقتی که ما شروع کردیم که تعریف کنیم این دفترمون رو که چه جور دفتری میخواد باشه، باید به این مسائل فکر می‌کردیم که ما چه سایز کارهایی رو می‌خوایم روش تمرکز کنیم و چه مدت زمانی رو، چه بازه‌ای رو داریم بهش نگاه می‌کنیم برای این هدفمون، برای این شرکت.
So the idea of giving the practice a almost like an expiration date both forces us to look very critically at the work that we do and the work that we accept, but also allows us to focus our efforts on a type of work that is both generational, it both belongs to the sort of generation of the people that we work in the office, but also to the sort of work that is happening currently in the context that we work in, which is the city of Madrid.
و به همین دلیل ما یک تاریخ انقضایی برای کار این دفتر گذاشتیم، یعنی یک تاریخ شروع و یک پایانی از اول مشخص کردیم که ما از سال 2021 داریم افتتاح می‌کنیم و 2030 تموم میشه فعالیت این دفتر و این تاثیر میذاره روی کارهایی که می‌خوایم انتخاب کنیم، بپذیریم مسئولیتش رو و همینطور همکاریمون با کارفرمایان مختلف در شهر مادرید.
So more broadly, our practice, we decided that it would not be a sort of individual entity, but actually would belong to a larger organization, in this case a non-profit foundation, that would carry the values that the practice should hold.
و ما به جای اینکه به دیدی که داشتیم به این دفتر، به جای این بود که یک شخصیت حقوقی مشخص و مالکیت خصوصی داشته باشه، ما بتونیم به شکل یک سازمان عامل منفعه بهش نگاه کنیم.
So this foundation, which is called the Own Foundation, which is a project that I started while I was a student at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, is a sort of non-profit organization that is committed to the decommodification of architecture and the built environment through both architectural models, but also financial models that sort of promote alternative ways of understanding ownership and the way that we own things, in this case, architecture in the city of Madrid.
و این دفتر رو که من ایدهش رو از وقتی که در دانشگاه هاروارد دانشجو بودم شروع کردم، یک مؤسسه نان پرافیت یا غیر انتفاعیه که تمرکز داره رو مسئله مالکیت و اینکه روی مسئله مالکیت شخصی و عمومی داریم کار میکنیم.
So in order to understand that, we also have to understand the context in which we've been working on, right? You following sort of the appearance of neoliberalism in the 1980s, the country of Spain started to belong part to that sort of political and economical legacy following the government of José María Aznar in the 1990s.
و میگه که ما برای اینکه اینو بفهمیم باید بستر این شکلگیری این ایده رو ببینیم که اون نقطه شروع ما، این بستر ما شروع یک جوری جریان نئولیبرال هست از دهه 80 که سمت چپ می‌بینیم تصویر تاچر و ایوان رو، و سمت راست دولتی که در اسپانیا سر کار بود در دهه 90.
So the consequence of such economic and political governance led to, as you probably know, to one of sort of the largest housing bubbles in contemporary history, in which Spain was a big sort of protagonist, right? The country of Spain in the first years of the 21st century built more housing than France, Germany, Italy, and England all together.
Wow. و این باعث شد، این پروژه نیولیبرالی که در جریان بود باعث شد که یک حباب مسکن ایجاد بشه در اسپانیا و اسپانیا شروع کرد که به شدت به تعداد بسیار زیاد مسکن جمعی درست کنه که جمعش در اون مدت در قرن 21 تعداد پروژه‌هایی که اجرا شده در اسپانیا از مجموع پروژه‌هایی که در انگلیس، فرانسه، آلمان و ایتالیا ساخته شده بیشتر هست.
However, we've seen how years later, once the housing bubble happened, things haven't really changed, right? After years of both political measures in order to sort of save the country from a complete bankruptcy, led to the sort of a free-for-all economic incentives that made Spain, especially the city of Madrid, into a sealed heaven for real estate speculation.
و این حبابی که ایجاد شد به دنبالش بحران اقتصادی رو آورد و مشکلاتی برای شهر مادرید درست کرد که محلی شد برای یک جور سرمایه گذاری.
Yeah. But unlike the 2000s, during which the real estate fever had spread nationwide, today's speculative wave is localized, and it's in cities like Madrid, in which the boom has sort of reignited.
برخلاف دهه 90 و این تب ریل استیتی که وجود داشت در مادرید و در اسپانیا، الان یک دوره جدیدی رو ما داریم تجربه می‌کنیم که دوباره این خواسته برای ساختن بیشتر شروع شده، ولی با تمرکز بیشتر بر منابع محلی.
However, the current housing crisis is not only one of scarcity or affordability, but also a crisis in the subjectivization of domestic space. Following the industrialization and banality of the urban environment in the 19th century, our homes have become a symbol of the commodification of life, a refuge where the purpose is not the use of the house anymore, but if it's the affirmation of its inhabitants' sense of ownership.
و حالا مسئله و مشکلی که وجود داره در زمان حاضر در مورد مسئله مسکن و خانه در مادرید فقط کم بودن یا گران بودنش نیست، بلکه مسئله کالایی سازی شدن مسکن، صنعتی شدن مسکن و اینکه تبدیل به یک کالا برای کالای رفاهی و برای سرمایه‌گذاری شده به جای اینکه یک جایی برای زندگی.
Today, global economic and political powers have established our contemporary understanding of housing as an immutable space where all functions are given, no longer responding to the everyday needs of its inhabitants, but rather the psychical interests of market forces that dictate how, when, and why we should be dwelling.
و امروز ما می‌بینیم که به جای اینکه به نیاز و خواسته های واقعی ساکنین این خونه ها توجه بشه، بیشتر به مسئله مارکت و اینکه چی بهتر میفروشه توجه میشه در امر مسکن.
So following that, I'll be presenting 3 projects that in one way or another sort of response to this situation, to this context, in order to offer a possible alternative in designing spaces, but also architecture that are more responsive against the speculation of the built environment.
و حالا ما تو این سه تا پروژه که میخوام بهتون نشون بدم در اسپانیا یک جوری میخوایم یک جوابی بدیم به این بستر و این طرح مسئله‌ای که کردم برات.
So in these projects, the idea of the room, and I'm using the word room very clearly, is quite important, right? So the idea of the room not only as the most essential typological unit that builds architecture, right? But also room as a definition of a sort of limited space.
و تو این پروژه مفهوم اتاق خیلی برای ما مهمه. اتاق نه به عنوان یک واحد تشکیل دهنده، واحد کوچیک تشکیل دهنده معماری، بلکه به عنوان یک فضایی با یک سری محدودیت‌ها مسئله است برای ما.
So we'll be talking along a few examples that sort of illustrate this, right? But hopefully, maybe one day we will be lucky enough to be assigned or commissioned to design a project that is only the size of one room, right? Like the Cornelius Mayer's one-room apartment, in which like all the functions happen within the limitation of just one physical space.
و میگه حالا یک سری مثال میخوایم ببینیم از اینا، مثل مثال قبلی که پروژه همش در باره یک اتاق بوده، تعریف کردن یک فضای داخلی یک اتاق.
The Palladian villas by Italian architect Andrea Palladio have always been a quite important sort of reference for us in the office, right? Because these were projects that were sort of composed through the aggregation of a series of spaces that didn't have a specific use or program attached to it, but it allowed the user to decide freely what they wanted to do, with each room, right, and respond to the architecture in a way that it was not sort of decisive.
و یکی از رفرنس‌های مهم تو دفتر ما که همیشه در موردش صحبت می‌کنیم این ویلاهای پالادیو هست و مسئله اتاق تو اینا که خیلی آزادن و هیچ پروگرام خاصی ندارن و یک فضای آزادیه که کاربر میتونه توش تعریف کنه فضاش.
And these projects are sort of built through the sort of subdivision of a series of a given perimeter. We'll talk about the idea of the perimeter a little later. In this case, the perimeter was most of the times a sort of a golden rectangle, right? But each of these rooms were just connected through a series of enfilades of sort of large central openings that would visually communicate all the spaces, while also allowing for certain individuality between them.
و این اتاقا که همشون تحت یک محیطی در اومدن و محدود شدن، یک رابطه‌ای با هم دارن، یک رشته اتاق هستن که در این حال که به هم متصلن ولی هر کدوم استقلال خودشون رو هم دارن.
However, there's a moment around the 19th century in which the idea of the home becomes overly commodified and every function starts to be specified within the architecture, right? The idea, in this case, for example, in this project by Robert Kerr of the Gentleman's House, the morning room, the dining room, the gentleman's room, the family room, the bedroom, right? Every single room in the house had a specific program attached to it, right? A specific use, which sort of forced the inhabitant to behave in a particular way and projected on the user a particular enforced way of living.
ولی از قرن 19 این پروژه معماری رفت به این سمت که معماری کالایی سازی بشه و به این ترتیب که هر اتاقی حالا یک اسم مشخص از قبل داده شده ای داشت، مثل اتاق فامیلی، اتاق مرد، اتاق زن، اتاق صبونه و همه اینا داشت تحمیل میکرد یک جور کالایی سازی رو به معماری.
This fixed image of dwelling has been later promoted by the influence of global economic and political powers that have established our contemporary understanding of housing as an immutable space where all functions are given.
و این بعداً امتداد پیدا کرد در زمانه آینده، جایی که در واقع انگار اون سیستم برای شما، سیستم سیاسی و اقتصادی برای شما تعیین میکرد که تو ساختمون چه اتفاقی میفته.
Even during sort of the abstraction of the modern movements, the idea of the home, of the domestic space, was still sort of overly subdivided and specified, even if in that case was through both spatial and economic efficiencies, like here the example of Alexander Klein's plan efficiency comparison.
و با وجود این که در دوران مدرنیسم معماری خیلی به سمت ابسترکشن و انتزاعی شدن پیشرفت، ولی همچنان ما این رشته رو توش می‌بینیم که به خاطر افیشنت شدن یک پلان یک خونه تو نمونه سعی کرده بودن که پروگرام رو توش کاملا مشخص کنن.
However, during that time, there were also a series of figures that were challenging or questioning that idea of blank generic space as being something passive, but actually one that could be very, very sort of critical and political against the sort of context of the time, in which we feel sort of ideologically very close to here in the office, which is, for example, Hans Meyer's co-op Zimmer.
ولی در همون جریان مدرنیسم هم شخصیتایی بودن که خلاف اون جریان غالب عمل میکردن و سعی میکردن که یک جور تصویر مخالف اون جریان و یک جور مقاومت در برابر اون جریان کالایی سازی نشون بدن، که یکیشون هانس میر هست در این پروژه کوآپ زیمر که ما از نظر ایدئولوژیکال خیلی احساس نزدیکی میکنیم بهش.
Here, the room of Meyer's co-op Zimmer is understood as the most basic unit of architecture, right? It's a space where you both accept your own individuality while also simultaneously acknowledging that you belong to a larger collective.
و این اتاق هانس میر یک واحد خیلی کوچیکیه که یک جوری نقطه مبدأ برای یک شخص که در این حال هم فردیت خودش رو درک میکنه ولی در این حال خودش رو عضو یک جمع یا یک کلکتیو میبینه.
And this was the idea that we experimented upon on one of the first projects in the office, which was a large multi-generational house for three families of different sort of ages that would live within the same sort of, let's say, the same construction, right? So we similar to the Palladian villas, we took a rectangle, we subdivided that rectangle, and through that built a series of rooms in which we were able to house a senior family, sort of established family with kids, and a young couple within the same rooms. And I sort of designed it in a way in which each of the families could sell or buy their rooms of their house through time and expand or decrease the size of their homes depending on their needs, right? So we sort of introduced the idea of time within the project.
و اینجا تو این پروژه‌ای که ما داریم ما اومدیم و اول یک گرید مثل خونه‌های پالادیو یک گرید هندسی روش انداختیم و این خونه‌ای که چند جنریشنی بوده، چند تا نسل مختلف توش زندگی می‌کردن، اومدیم یک سری واحد مختلف درست کردیم که خانواده‌ها توی میتونن بر اساس نیاز چند تا خانواده همزمان زندگی کنن و بر اساس نیازشون به اون فضا هر چقدر که میخوان از این فضاها بخرن یا بفروشن، کم و زیاد کنن فضای مورد نیازشون رو طرف.
So that was an idea that we later continued on a series of commissions here at the office, which I'll be explaining now. These three projects. The first of all was it's here in the city of Madrid. The demand of new housing has become so crazy, right? That we are no longer able or even capable of building new buildings. And so we have the necessity of working within the sort of the city fabric that we already have. So renovating existing apartments is sort of integral part of the production of an architecture office today here in Madrid.
و حالا این پروژه که من بهتون مشخص نشون میدم در این راستا هم و یک مسئله مهم در مورد بازسازی، پروژه بازسازی وجود داره که یکی از پروژه هایی که الان به تعداد خیلی زیادی داره در اینجا در مادرید اتفاق میفته و نمونه هایی ازش رو اینجا میدم.
So Lara House, which is the first of these projects, it was a 65 square meter apartment located in the city center. And in this case, we were given again a perimeter, right? And I'm saying this very importantly because when designing these interior apartments, we don't look at them through the lens of, let's say, interior architecture, right? But more through the lens of architecture per se, right? Which we understand these projects almost as buildings that don't have a facade, right? A building without an exterior elevation, and a building that it's all about its interiority. And when you think about these projects in that way, and you allow to think them through the lens of architecture, a different set of problems start to sort of appear.
و ما این پروژه لارا هاوس که می‌بینید اینجا دارم بهتون نشون میدم، این پروژه هم مثل پروژه بازسازی دیگری محیط پلان به ما داده شده، از قبل مشخص و فیکس قابل تغییر نیست، ولی ما به اینا رو به شکل پروژه اینتریور دیزاین، اینتریور آرکیتکچر نگاه نمی‌کنیم. ما اینا رو به شکل یک پروژه معماری نگاه می‌کنیم بدون فاساد، انگار که یک ساختمونیه، یک پروژه معماریه که فقط فاساد و اون پوسته بیرونی رو نداره و با این لنز بهش نگاه می‌کنیم که حالا توضیح میدم.
So again, similarly to those Palladian villas, we took our perimeter and decided to subdivide it into an asymmetrical grid of four equal rooms and two smaller rooms on the bottom. That created sort of isotropic space with four spaces, pretty much 4 rooms with no programs assigned, no uses assigned, and allowed for the future inhabitant to decide what to do with each of these spaces.
و مثل پروژه قبلی ما همون گرید پالادیان رو انگار روی این کار انداختیم که غیر قرینه هم بود و صرفا اومدیم 4 تا اتاق تعریف کردیم به علاوه فضای کوچیک، 2 تا فضای کوچیک در پایین، 4 تا اتاق بدون که هیچ فانکشن یا پروگرام مشخصی بهشون بدیم تقریبا، و گذاشتیم که در واقع این اجازه رو می‌خوایم به یوزر بدیم که خودش تعیین کنه چی می‌خواد باشه.
So the idea of negation is sort of quite important in this sort of project, right? We are negating its perimeter, we are negating its orientation, we are negating program. The idea of sort of eliminating, we're somehow reducing the amount of elements that we work with in order to just try to design with the most essential bare elements of architecture.
و این ایده نفی کردن برای ما خیلی مهمه. ما همه چیز رو، همه داده‌های قبلی رو نفی می‌کنیم، ساختارهای قبلی که از قبل داده شده رو نفی می‌کنیم تا اینکه در واقع به اون نقطه مبدئی که می‌خوایم برای معماری برسیم.
So the result is this. The result was simply just 4 rooms and nothing else, right? And we were super happy to just design something so basic but also so essential, right? A series of spaces in which the inhabitant could just dwell, right? The house would no longer sort of project on the inhabitant how they should be dwelling, right? So that the house does not fall into the naming or connotations of real estate development. It is not a 1-bedroom apartment. It's not a 2-bedroom apartment. It doesn't have a master bedroom, like which we hate the idea of the master bedroom. We have to question that already, right? With the ensuite bathroom and so on, right? It's just 4 spaces for you to decide what to do with them.
و خب ما با این یک خونه ساده صرفا درست کردیم برای اینکه توش زندگی کنن و اینا اسم ندارن که بخوان بنگاه املاکی اینا رو به اسم اتاق خونه 1 خوابه یا 2 خوابه بفروشه یا بخواد باش پول در بیاره، یا مثلا ما یک مستر بدرومی داشته باشیم که من اصلا ایده مستر بدروم رو از اول دوست ندارم.
So the result was a sort of a simple, just bare bones house, and so bare that we almost reduced every single element present in the house, right? There's an abstraction to it that we are extremely interested in, right? The floor was reduced into also a sort of continuous red linoleum flooring with no joints, a way of almost even abstracting materiality to a way in which, again, maybe tying back to Arian's introduction, sort of the idea of the material gets completely sort of eliminated, no?
و اینجا ما این پروژه رو می‌بینیم که کاملا ابسترکت شده، کاملا انتزاعی و ساده سازی شده، حتی مصالح کف تبدیل شده به یک رنگ یک دست بدون هیچ درزی و این یک جورایی به همون ایده دیاگرام آرین که اول دیدیم با هم مربوطه که ما این متریال رو ابسترکتش کرد.
More so, we even sort of diluted the idea of the perimeter in this project by locating a series of mirrored surfaces that would amplify the idea that sort of the spatial limits of the project. What we did was, in a way, understand that this grid that we were introducing into the given perimeter of the apartment was an endless grid, a generic grid that therefore would somehow expand and work beyond the limits of the apartment.
و ما حالا با این آینه هایی که اینجا گذاشتیم یک جورایی اومدیم تأکیدی کردیم روی این لیمیت یا محدودیتی که تو این ساختمون داشتیم و اون رو دوباره به نوع دیگری بازنمایی کردیم.
So again, in projects like this, in which the architecture becomes so, in a way, so conceptually generic, but also spatially tremendously specific, in which the architecture tries to project as least as possible on the user, right? Tries to be as passive as possible. The objects that inhabit it, and therefore also the users that inhabit it, become the most important elements, right? So we always like to draw these furniture plans with no walls, with no architecture, right? Trying to almost explain our projects, not within the limits of the architecture, but explain the objects through, explain the projects through the objects that inhabit it, and therefore explain the lives that could potentially live within it.
و ما باز همونطور که توضیح دادم سعی کردیم که در عین حال هم یک رویکرد جنریک داشته باشیم، هم اسپسیفیک. جنریک از این جهت که هیچ چیزی رو تحمیل نکنیم، هیچ استفاده یا مبلمان مشخصی رو خونه خودمون تحمیل نکنیم، ولی از این جهت پروژه کاملا میتونه اسپسیفیک بشه، چون اون کاربره که اونطوری که میخواد اونجا رو میتونه اشغال کنه و در واقع نظام زندگیش رو بچینه.
Great. So there were very few moments in which that sort of generic space becomes obstructed, right? That generic grid becomes obstructed, which is in the moment in which the grids sort of clashes upon the given perimeter, right? And moments in which that sort of diagonal wall of the fireplace, or maybe sort of the kitchen countertop on the back, a series of elements that start to give a sense of orientation or hierarchy, right? A hierarchy that we try to eliminate, but of course there's an inevitable, right, elements that you have to sort of work within and that we also sort of acknowledge in the work, no?
و ما در نهایت با این وجود که این سعی می‌کردیم این گرید خیلی خالص افلاطونی رو نگه داریم، یک جاهایی به محدودیت‌های می‌خوردیم، به اون شومینه می‌خوردیم، به آشپزخونه می‌خوردیم، جایی که اون محیط خونه داره خودش رو به ما تحمیل می‌کنه.
So again, this idea of working with mirrored surfaces allowed us to play within sort of the visual limits of architecture, which is something that we love in our work and that we use in several projects, in which, for example, here in the bathroom, the idea of the sort of expanding to the limitless, right? The sort of the physical, again, limits of the given perimeter allows us to in a way be extremely strict with the limits that we create for ourselves, the sort of very, very strict grids that we impose upon ourselves, that then we simultaneously dilute with the use of materials, or maybe in the case of the walls, of sort of hyper abstract materials, or in the case of the mirror, almost like the non-material, right? A material that is capable of just completely disappearing.
و خب ما این ایده استفاده از آینه رو ادامه دادیم که یک واکنشی بود به محدودیتی که گرید به ما میده. از یه طرف گرید میخواد ما رو محدود کنه، از یه طرف داره باهاش وارد چالش میشه این آینه ها و انگار فضا رو دارن نامحدود میکنن و این کانسپتی بود که ما بهش علاقه داشتیم.
The next project I'll be talking about, which is Run the House, follows a similar logic, and maybe we should like go a little faster through this project in order to because the ideas are quite similar, but maybe there's certain differences that we can discuss. Right? Again, we were giving an apartment in the center of the city. Again, an apartment that had to be renovated. And again, we were given a perimeter, right? So the sort of the physical perimeter of the apartments. In this case, these perimeters always have already give a series of elements that we have to respond to, right? Which is, for example, the sort of the plumbing shaft or the window on the corner. There's a series of irregularities that we work with, and that our grid in this case responded to with this sort of asymmetrical grids that again was trying to subdivide the space, but at the same time it tries to be tremendously generic, right? But that sort of genericism is pretty much impossible in the moment that you're already responding to a existing perimeter.
و این ترم در پروژه مختلف ما تکرار میشه. ما اول اون شهر رو داریم و اون بستری که داریم و بعد محدودیت دور تا دور هر کدوم از این واحدهای مسکونی هستن و اون گرید تقریبا پالادیویی ما که اومده و داره سعی میکنه خودش رو تطبیق بده با همون محدودیت ساخت و ساختمون و تأسیسات و چیزایی که در اون سایت موجوده.
Great. So again, the space was subdivided into a series of rooms. In this case, the maybe less radical than the first apartment. In this case, we said divided into 6 rooms. That again had followed the same logic, right? The idea of a series of spaces that one could just inhabit freely, right? The result was this, right? In this case, maybe the idea of the nth lad was achieved physically, right? We didn't need to use the sort of the mirrored surfaces in order to amplify sort of this expansion of space.
این پروژه دیگه که ما اومدیم و همین گرید رو روش انداختیم و فضاهای مساوی درست کردیم مثل قبلی، ولی اینجا دیگه نیاز نبود که این انفلات یا رشته اتاق‌ها رو ما با آینه درست کنیم. اینجا میتونستیم این فرصت رو داشتیم که این عمق رو و این اکسپنشن افزایش فضا رو به این ترتیب به صورت فیزیکی نشون بدیم و بسازیم.
So here, for example, the use of the mirrored surfaces was used in order to dilute or eliminate as much as possible one of the few elements that one cannot avoid when designing spaces like this, right? Which is those spaces that are sort of immutable, which pretty much relates to the use of infrastructure, of plumbing, which are, let's say, the bathroom and the cooking area, right? By wrapping the cooking area in mirrors, we were able somehow to dilute and disappear this space as much as possible.
و ما باز اینجا میبینیم که پروژه محدودیت‌هایی داره. یه جای مثلا مثل فضای آشپزی یا آشپزخونه یک المانایی داریم که داره از اون خلوص یا سادگی یا خالی بودن اتاق‌ها کم میکنه و باز ما با گذاشتن آینه تو اینا سعی کردیم که این بازی رو بین اینا انجام بدیم، بین این بازی جنریک و اسپسیفیک که داره اتفاق میفته.
So I like passing and swapping these images over and over because they explain very clearly the fact that again, these large apertures, these that connect each of the spaces, allow sort of visually sort of frame, but also connect the different rooms within the house.
و این درگاه‌هایی که ما داریم انگار یک جور فریمن یا یک جور قابن که دارن موقعیت تو این تصاویر مرتب می‌بینید اینا دارن موقعیت این اتاق‌ها رو به هم نشون میدن.
So again, the furniture plan, a way of understanding these projects not through the physical limits of its architecture, but through the sort of imagination of the possible uses or the possible users that could potentially live within these limits. Right? in which again in this case the sort of the material entity of the project was even reduced much more. There's again a certain negation of the material presence of the project.
تو پلان قبلی ما دیدیم که یک سری فرنیچر پیشنهاد شده بود، فرنیچری که ما باز چند مدل پیشنهاد می‌کردیم یا تصور می‌کردیم در واقع برای معماری بدون اینکه بخوایم اونها رو تحمیل کنیم به این خونه. و بعد باز اینجا تو متریال، تو مسائل این ساختمون می‌بینیم که چقدر متریالیتی نفی داره میشه و چقدر داره به سمت ابسترکت شدن میره.
In this case, maybe if I do you have a picture of it? Yes, it was interesting. We like to sort of contradict ourselves through our own projects, and there was an interest of reducing and eliminating any sense of scale, of material presence in any of the surfaces. However, when deciding what to do with the ceiling, we splashed this how do you say, the plaster. We splashed the sort of raw plaster on the ceiling, creating this almost baroque effect of a sort of low-tech ornament that was uncontrolled, right? There's a complete sort of precise control of every single element within the house, but this moment of unpredictability of the ceiling is something that we were actually very interested in.
و باز ما خواستیم این ایده خودمون رو چالش بکشیم در برابر این گرایشی که داشتیم همه چیز ابسترکت بشه، انتزاعی بشه، بدون اسکیل و مقیاس باشه. در برابرش سعی کردیم که روی سقف این مصالح خیلی کنترل نشده، یک جوری انگار گچ پاشیده شده روی دیوار که یک بافتی داره، یک جوری اورنامنت یا تزیینات خیلی لوتک معماری محسوب میشه رو بذاریم و این رو در تقابل بگیریم با گرایشمون در بقیه ساختمان.
And again, there's talking back about the idea of negation. There's a total negation even of the orientation of the house by covering the windows with sort of this milky window that allows light to come inside, but doesn't allow you to know where you are located within the house.
و باز این نفی که داریم انجام میدیم در جاهای مختلف این پروژه، یک نفیش در مورد جهت این ساختمونه و ما با پوشوندن با غیر شفاف کردن شیشه ها حتی داریم جلوی جهتیابی با اساس رسیدن نور به داخل رو میگیریم که متوجه نشیم دقیقاً به کدوم سمت چرخیده.
And however, this sort of material and conceptual abstraction is something that we have sort of as architects fabricated, right, within the office. The reality is precisely this, right? And I love showing this photograph of the actual material construction of the project, of the patio behind it, the fact that these walls were built with clay bricks, which it's such an idiosyncratic building material in the country of Spain, right? The idea of working with bricks belongs so much to sort of the collective memory of construction and architecture in Spain.
ولی در واقع واقعیت این ساختمون این بود که می‌بینیم و من این تصویر رو خیلی دوست دارم. این نوع آجر یا بلوکی که داره، بلوک سفالی که داره استفاده میشه، این یک مسئله خیلی مرسومه در اسپانیا و یک جور خاطره جمعی مردم با این دارن و اینه که در واقع پوسته ما رو داره شکل میده.
And I'm showing this picture in order to tie back to the following project. Again, if we talk about brick construction as being part of this sort of collective idea of what construction means in Spain, and I'm actually just looking at a brick building right in front of me. The idea of building with brick was something that we continued on another project, which was the construction of a temporary pavilion in northern Spain, right? In which, in this case, we sort of pushed the idea of the material entity of the projects. If the first two projects were all about sort of material abstraction and material negation, this project was the complete opposite, right? It was about taking the idea of the material and let's say, stretching it to its maximum sort of capacity.
و این علاقه‌ای که ما به آجر داریم و این همینجوری از پنجره که دارم نگاه می‌کنم من روبروم ساختمان آجری می‌بینم. تصمیم گرفتیم که پروژه بعدی این رو ادامه بدیم و این بار برخلاف پروژه قبلی که حالا اون رو نفی می‌کردیم و می‌پوشوندیم، اینجا بیایم این رو اکسپرس کنیم و یک پروژه موقتی در شمال اسپانیا که بهتون نشون میدم.
This pavilion, which we titled Types of Spaces, was a temporary pavilion that we built for a design festival in the city of Logroño in northern Spain. And while in the first two projects, the sort of physical context in which the projects were located, these sort of given perimeters, was again completely negated and completely avoided. In this one, the project couldn't be more contextual, right? It belongs to the place in which is built. It belongs to the city within which is built, and the place within which is built with such extreme importance that both context and build project are almost part of the same entity.
و این پروژه هم دلیل اینکه رویکرد متفاوت بود این کانتکست یا زمینه‌ای بود که در این شهر در شمال اسپانیا داره، به خاطر اینکه زمین برای شهر بود و یک تاریخی داشت. اینجا ما این رویکرد رو پیش گرفتیم و خواستیم که در یک ارتباطی با اون بستر برقرار کنیم در پروژه.
Here what we're looking at is the old tobacco factory of the city. A huge, large piece of almost urban infrastructure that's sort of that was part of let's say it was a large chunk of architecture, of building within the city, right? So years late, and here's another photograph of that project. And take a good look at the sort of chimney on the back, and also the chimney on this photograph, because it's an important element of the project, right? It was a project that it was a factory that years later, as we see in this plan, there was they sort of created a void within the project, almost like a Mata Clark cut in the building, which created the space in which we sort of centuries later we intervened.
و بستر اینجا در واقع کارخانه تنباکو خیلی بزرگی بوده که یک بخش مهمی از شهر بوده و بعداً یک قسمتی از این مجموعه ساختمان‌ها بریده میشه، تقریبا شبیه پروژه گوردون ماتا کلارک، و بعد ما اینجا می‌بینیم این فضای خالی درست میشه برای اینکه حالا ما جایی که ما میتونستیم این پروژه رو بسازیم توش، این شکاف بین این ساختمان‌ها موجود.
So here's a sort of a site plan and the first sort of physical models of the project, in which what our intention was to reconstruct that urban void and give the space back its former architectural presence by reconstructing first sort of the facades of the project and working within again a given perimeter that we later sort of subdivided.
و ما هدفمون در واقع این بود که دوباره اون قسمتی که از شهر گرفته شده رو بازسازی کنیم و دوباره بتونیم اون رو بسازیم و به شهر پس بدیم.
The result was this, a very narrow space that we subdivided into a series of, maybe I can even draw this, into a series of rectangular rooms, each of them measuring 3.5 by 3.5 meters, in which we later, if in the first projects we just left the rooms completely untouched and allowed for the idea of the sort of canonical room, the four walls, the sort of triad corner, as the main sort of spatial character of the room. Here in this case, we actually played with the idea of what of different types in this case, and I mean the name of the pavilion is quite literal, right? Different types of spaces in which the sort of the user had to respond to, right?
ما این فضا رو همونطور که تو پلان می‌بینیم تقسیم بندی کردیم. هر فضا 3 متر و نیم در 3 متر و نیم هست تقریبا، و تو هر کدوم برخلاف پروژه قبلیمون که صرفاً یک اتاق 4 دیواری کانونیکال بود به قول معروف، یک اتاق خالی. اینجا سعی کردیم یک سری تایپ مختلف تو هر کدوم از این فضاها یک سری تایپ های مختلف درست کنیم که در این تصویر می‌بینید.
Let me delete this. The result was this. It was again the sort of the lining up of a series of rooms, each of them connected by again sort of a central aperture that creates a visual enfilade across all of them, right? But if in the first project the grid was a little more expansive, here in this case the grid was completely linear. No?
و نتیجهش این چیزیه که می‌بینیم که یک سری باز درگاه‌های مختلف ما می‌بینیم مثل پروژه قبلی، ولی فرقی با پروژه قبلی داره اینه که اینجا یک رابطه خطی اینا با هم دارن و در امتداد هم قرار گرفتن این اتاقا.
The result was again the chaining of a series of rooms, each of them with a different spatial character. That gave the project an almost playful sort of entity, somehow maybe closer to the idea of playful public spaces that architect Aldo van Eyck sort of imagined.
و این نتیجه این میشد که میبینیم و یک جور شخصیت پلیفول یا یک فضای برای کنجکاوی و گردش در شهر درست کرد، شاید چیزی شبیه فضاهایی که آلدو وان آیک در پروژه شهریش درست میکرد.
So when building the project, the idea of using one material was fundamental for us, right? If in the Ronda house, everything was sort of covered in this continuous plaster floor, ceiling, and walls. Here, it was important to us to use again one single material and stretch it to its maximum sort of possibilities, right? Which was the idea of the brick. And we used the brick for one particular reason, right? Which was because it was a material. It was not only a material that gave us sort of again a material continuity, but it was also material units, right? We could build the entire project with the repetition with one unit, which later would allow us to sort of dismantle the project unit by unit, brick by brick, and try to have the least sort of carbon impact in the construction of this pavilion.
و ما توی این پروژه مثل پروژه قبلی تصمیم گرفتیم فقط از یک مساله استفاده کنیم و اونجا این مساله آجر بود و کلش رو با این آجر ساختیم و این نه تنها یک امتدادی برای ما درست میکنه بلکه باعث میشه یک واحد کوچیک ما داشته باشیم که تشکیل دهنده کل باشه و بعداً چون که این یک پاویلیون موقت بود بتونیم این رو آجرها رو به قول معروف یکی یکی جمع کنیم و پروژه رو بتونیم از اونجا برداریم و این در شرایطی که با این کار ما کمترین تاثیر بر تولید کربن رو داریم و کمترین تاثیر بر محیط زیست با این نوع ساخت.
So these bricks, the pavilion was built by joining the bricks with sort of a plastic glue that allowed the pavilion to have enough stability for it to be a temporary installation. Of course, it doesn't have this ability for it to be a sort of a joinery material to actually build a house, but it was enough to build a pavilion, which allowed us to have this sort of almost inexisting sort of joineries, right? Almost just having the bricks stacked one on top of each other, right? And once the project with the sort of the pavilion or the festival ended, the project was dismantled brick by brick and was retrieved by the construction company that built it and used in other different projects that we're working on, right? So it would be a beautiful thing to do to sort of track where each of the pieces of this pavilion are now sort of dispersed across the city of Logroño in different houses and buildings across.
Very interesting. و این رو ما اومدیم با استفاده از چون که سازه موقت بود و قرار نبود دائمی اونجا باشه با استفاده از یک جور چسب پلاستیک اینا رو به هم چسبوندیم که خب مقاومت کافی رو واسه مدت محدودی که این می‌خواست اونجا باشه به ما میداد و باعث شد یک جور جوینت ها یا اتصالات ساده‌ای برسیم برای اجرای این در نهایت این پروژه به راحتی جمع شد، باز به همین دلیل که ساده اینا از هم جدا میشد و تمام این آجر بعداً در پروژه مختلف استفاده شد یا داره میشه و این خیلی جالب خواهد بود که اگه ما بتونیم این رو پیگیری کنیم یا ترک کنیم، ببینیم هر کدوم از این قطعات آجر در کجا هستن یا در چه ساختمانی استفاده شد.
So when deciding what to also do with the floor, how we would sort of design the floor of the pavilion, we knew that we wanted that again a sort of a material continuity of the project, but we knew that it had to be brick, right? So we used these discarded sort of brick chips that we found while visiting the brick factory. At the outskirts of the factory, there were these huge mountains of discarded bricks that we asked the owner what were those mountains, and
من فکر میکنم که یک لحظه به نظر میاد باتری لپتاپ ادواردو تموم شد. تا برگرده من چیزی که تا الان داشت میگفت رو توضیح بدم که میگه که ما دنبال این بودیم که این امتداد مصالح رو داشته باشیم و بتونیم که بتونیم که این از مصالح یک دست کل این رو بسازیم، ولی برای کفش رفتیم وقتی از این کارخونه آجر بازدید کردیم، برای کفش یک سری چیپس آجر بود، مثل خورده آجری که تو این کارخونه جمع شده بود، کوهی جمع شده بود از این خورده آجرها و اینا رو ما ازش احتمالاً داشت میگفت که داشتیم میپرسیدیم که اینا چیه و اینا و از همین کوه خورده آجرهای اضافی استفاده کردن برای اینکه کف اونجا رو بپوشونن و این یک دستی مصالح رو توش حفظ کنن. الان به من پیغام داد که همینطور که من فکر میکردم باتری لپتاپش تمام شده ولی داره برمیگرده و تا ثانیه های دیگه فکر میکنم دوباره داشته باشیم ادواردو. Okay.
Sorry for that. Am I still here?
No worries. Yeah, I had time to translate what you were saying so far. So
okay, good. Man, I'm so sorry, everyone. Apologies. I thought that the battery was going to last for the lecture. I'm sorry. Anyways, what I was saying, so we found this sort of large mountain of discarded bricks. We asked the owner what those were, and he told us that those were just sort of garbage for him. Those were bricks that were or distorted during the fabrication process or were deformed, and therefore were bricks that he could not sort of commercialize or sell, and therefore it would just like throw them. And we saw that pile of what the owner of the factory pretty much considered garbage as a design opportunity, right? And we asked the owner if he could give us that pile of discarded bricks for free, because it had zero value for him, and we gave it sort of as a secondary value by creating this sort of continuous floor of discarded bricks. That it created two things, right? Of course, it created this feeling of a continuous material environment, as I was explaining before, but also something that we did not expect, right? And I love when a project sort of surprises you beyond what you thought it would do, right? Which the sort of the chips on the floor made everyone walk a little more slowly while visiting the pavilion, right? It sort of slowed the pace of the visitors. There was a sort of cracking on the floor, almost as broken glass, which created a different temporality inside of the project. As a place that sort of a street or a passageway that used to be a place of passing by, it suddenly became a place staying still, right? Of slowing down the pace.
Very interesting. و حالا در مورد اینا میگه که آره ما این قطعات خلاصه خورده آجر رو از رئیس کارخونه خواستیم به ما به صورت مجانی بده تو پروژه‌مون استفاده کنیم، برای اینکه عملاً یک چیز اضافی بود برای اونا و هیچ ارزشی نداشت و می‌خواستن بریزن دور و ما این رو استفاده کردیم. و حالا این دو تا خاصیت برای ما داشت. خاصیت اولش این بود که از قبل بهش فکر کرده بودیم که یک دستی میداد در مصالح به ما در اینجا، و حالی خاصیت دومش چیزی بود که بهش فکر نکرده بودیم ولی این باعث شد که راه رفتن آدما سرعتش کم شه و حالا این محل، این راهرو بین دو تا ساختمون یک محل صرفا برای عبور سریع نباشه و سرعت آدما رو کم کرد و باعث شد که با توجه بیشتری تو این فضاها بمونن و وقت بیشتری رو بگذرونن تو این فضا.
So it was interesting to see how people reacted to this project. There was precisely because it allowed the sort of the citizens of the city of Logroño to understand a space that somehow had been forgiven, right? To understand again this passageway as a space that had before a sort of an architectural presence, a space that actually one could inhabit, sit, play, meet people, right? And it, in a way, it brought back that memory, a memory that had been sort of long forgotten of this sort of unused, narrow, urban space in the middle of the city.
و این باعث شد که یک فضایی که تقریبا فضای فراموش شده بود برای ساکنین این شهر در اسپانیا، این دوباره زنده بشه و توجه کنن به این فضایی که قبلا یک جورایی انکار می‌شد.
So if we look back to the three projects that we've seen today, Ronda House, the types of faces pavilion, and Lara House, they all three follow sort of a similar logic, right? I mean, and beyond sort of the spatial similarity of using sort of this technique of enfilade, which is nothing new, right? But there's an intention of wanting to design a series of projects in which, again, its material entity is somehow eliminated in order to allow the architecture to be what it is as much as possible, right? To try to sort of negate and eliminate anything that distracts the work from what it has to do, right? Which is to provide a space of dwelling, that is non-determining, a space of dwelling that does not force the user to behave in a particular way, but a pretty much space in its most sort of basic and typological sort of sense, right?
و این تو این سه تا پروژه می‌بینید که در واقع ما یک رویکرد داشتیم تو همه اینا و این بود که فضا رو به بیسیک ترین حالت ممکن یا ساده ترین حالت ممکن تقلیل بدیم برای اینکه صرفاً به استفادهش توجه بشه و در واقع هر برچسبی رو، هر پیش‌فرضی رو از این فضاها جدا کنیم که در این سه قاب می‌بینیم.
And with that, I would like to finish my presentation. Thank you very much for everyone for listening, and I'm more than happy to continue the conversation and answer any questions or comments that anyone has. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Edwardo. This was fascinating. I really enjoyed. خب تشکر میکنه. لکچرش تموم شد و ازتون میخواد که هر سوالی دارین بپرسین. من صفحه کانون رو چک میکنم ببینم چه سوالاتی میتونین کامنت بذارین و مطرح میشه، ولی اول خودم یک سوالی ازش میپرسم تا ما سوالا رو بگیم. Okay, let me ask a question before we open it to audience. I use this privilege to ask the first question. So, can we go to the very last slide of this? I'm really fascinated by this. And I see a repeating theme. Maybe it also relates to what I was talking about in the beginning in terms of concept, this binary of having a perfect abstract, almost Palladian grid space or canonical room that you mentioned, juxtaposing this to the real world, the imperfections and stuff that are given, so it's not in our hands, that you explain in your projects. And I really like that we kind of see this in almost all of these frames, and there is some irritant in all these that is trying to reduce that. We keep seeing this challenge. Like in the left-hand side, we see that single column that is breaking the symmetry. Right-hand side, we see the kitchen counter, and, which is doing that. And maybe in the center one, this is probably the most perfect one, but the joint at the end in the center, you can't, like, it's not a 45 angle joint. So still is not super perfect, like Platonic geometry. And you were also saying something about this when you talk about the plaster shot on the top of the around the house on the left-hand side. That I was gonna ask you that, do you like these irritants? Do you like these imperfections? Do you welcome these, or you prefer to have the Platonic clean, like space or geometry? And I think you started to say that you kind of not only welcome these imperfections, but also you try to make these imperfections in the project sometimes as the ceiling and the
I mean, that's precisely the thing, right? That these projects try, in a way, there's that precisely the things that you're mentioning are the ones that acknowledge the fact that there's no such thing as a generic space, right? Even if we talk about creating these sort of just generic projects, there's no such thing as something generic, right? There's even the most generic aspect of it is completely hyper specific, right? The fact that we are working within a given perimeter, a perimeter that we cannot avoid, that we are working with a given material, that we're working with a given context, both economical, political, cultural, all of these things build all of the projects, right? So there's in a way there's a certain negation, and I'd rather use the word negation than reduction. It's not about minimalism. I hate sort of the sense of minimalism, but there's a certain negation of a series of elements that we try to work with, right? But there's others that you just cannot negate, right? There's no way that we could eliminate sort of the column at the end. There is no way that we could eliminate sort of having a kitchen countertop on the project, right? And those, it is those elements, the ones that give you enough tips in order to, let's say, start the projects, right? Like having a project that is completely tabula rasa, like completely blank page, is totally frightening, right? There's always something that you have to sort of hold on to and to grasp onto, right? And even in and it is those that you were calling them imperfections, but it is those moments, those elements that give you at least a place to start, right? When subdividing the Ronda house, already the perimeter is, no matter how abstract that we want to sort of understand it, it's hyper specific. It's a rectangle. There's no such thing as specific as that, right? And that already gives you enough tips to already start the project.
Very interesting. Let me translate this. I try to remember everything.
Sorry.
No worries, it's good. من ازش سوال کردم که توی صحبتت همیشه یک تنشی هست بین این کمال یا پرفکشن افلاطونی هندسه و گرید در کارت و تمام اون نقاطی که انگار کامل نیستن یا دارن از اون کم میکنن، و مثالهایی زدم از این پروژه که میبینیم از اون خلوص افلاطونی هندسی، و گفت آره این رو ما تو پروژه هامون همیشه داریم و اصلا نمیشه تصور کرد اون پروژه پرفکت کامل جنریک رو. همیشه هر پروژه در این حال اسپسیفیک ما حتی تصورش ترسناکه و همیشه یک واقعیتی تو پروژه هست که خودش رو نشون میده و این نقطه شاید برای تفکر باشه. همه اونا تضاد و تقابل این دوتا روی کرد توی پروژه ها که در موردش صحبت کرد. Okay, I have another question. One of my friends is asking that can you explain again the reason behind setting an expiration date for the practice? They want to know a little more about the hangar, the organization, and how.
Yeah, maybe we can go back to that first slide of the.
Yeah.
So there were some, we had actually, we were lucky enough to use sort of the pause of the pandemic in order to allow ourselves to sort of rethink what sort of practice we wanted to be, right? And which is something that sort of hardly ever happens, right? You're always so busy doing stuff and working that you don't really can allow yourself sort of 3-4 months or 6 months of just like sitting back and reflecting on who you are, who you want to be, what do you do, and what is it you want to do, right? Mm-hmm. And we use that time to actually question the mere sort of idea of what an architecture practice was, right? As this sort of huge machine that would endlessly grow and grow and grow into something larger. And I'll stop here so you can translate, Ari.
من اینکه خیلی وقت بود که داشتم به این فکر میکردم و به اینکه این چه حدی بالاخره داره شروع کردن یک شرکت میتونه تبدیل به یک ماشینی بشه، تبدیل به یک دستگاهی بشه که تا ابد بزرگ بشه و امتداد پیدا کنه و هیچ کنترلی روی این وجود نداره.
So the moment that we decided to give the office an expiration date allowed us not only to focus our work, to decide what sort of work that we would be doing now would be completely different from the one that we'll be doing in 10 years, right? We're now in our 30s. We're sort of in a very specific sort of generational moment in our lives that will be completely different when we're in our 40s and our 50s and our 60s. So the idea that the architecture office would be this sort of small thing that would in the future grow and grow and grow into sort of the aspiration of an office that would be much larger, something that we completely reject, right? Like the office is what it is right now. It's sort of, it belongs to the moment in which it is working. It belongs to sort of the generation within which we are working, and that was very important to us.
Great. و میگه که این واسه من یه چیزی مهم بود که بتونیم تو دهه، میگه الان ما تو دهه 30 زندگیمون 30 خورده سالگی هستیم و این کاری که تو این دهه میکنیم قطعا با کاری که در آینده میکنیم متفاوته و میخوایم که شخصیت اینا رو هم از هم مستقل کنیم و برای هر دوره‌ای، هر دهه‌ای بتونیم یک کاراکتر مشخص برای همون رو تعریف کنیم و بر اساس اون پرکتیس اون رو شکل بدیم. Okay, I have another question for you about the social media, because we talk a lot about negation here, and what we see growing on social media is like different influences. We see new things every day, multiple new things. We are kind of overwhelmed by the passion for novelty and trends and do you think there is a sort of interest in negating that in your work too, or do you think you're influenced by the social media? What's your theory about that?
Yeah, that is a really good question. So it is twofold. I think we live in a time in this sort of we live in a time of the sort of information economy, right? So the more information you share, the better, right? There's a certain almost thrive to an overexposure of the work that you do and the work that you're constantly doing and so on. And when we designed, for example, our website, we wanted to avoid having an architecture website that was hyper specific or hyper explicit, right? That it would share too much information, right? So that's why we designed a website that was just a simple scroll, a bunch of images that people sometimes wouldn't understand and would say like, I don't get the project. I'm just seeing a bunch of photographs, but what are these projects, right? And we didn't really care, right? We wanted to keep some cards to ourselves. And I'll stop here and I'll continue later.
در مورد شبکه‌های اجتماعی ازش پرسیدم که این در واقع چیز روزمره‌ای که ما داریم که هر روز داریم تصاویر زیاد متنوع دریافت می‌کنیم و هر روز چیز جدید و محتوای جدید میاد، رویکرد شما چیه؟ چون که یک جور انکار و نفی بود توی همه چیز، توی رویکرد توی این پروژه هایی که ما میدیدیم و سعی میشد که همه چیز کنار گذاشته بشه و به یک خلوصی رسیده بشه. سوال کردم که رویکرد شما در مورد این قضیه چیه توی پروژه هاتون و چجوری نگاه میکنید؟ سوشال مدیا یه جایی برای اینکه شما رو تحت تاثیر بذاره یا اینکه سعی میکنید ازش دوری کنید فضای اجتماعی؟ و گفت که ما چیزی که برامون مهمه در مورد اینفورمیشن تکنولوژی اینه که ما همه چیز رو خیلی حساب شده و به اندازه بتونیم در اختیار کاربرامون بذاریم و در اختیار بقیه بذاریم و همه چیز رو یک دفعه باز نکنیم. حتی اگه وبسایت ما بریم اینجوری نیست که عکس همه پروژه و همه این تصاویر توش باشه و سعی می‌کنیم یک مجموعه تصویر کنترل شده رو وارد این فضا بکنیم در واقع.
And I mean, to continue that, yes, there's a sort of need for constantly producing content that is consumed by others, right? Somehow it's like if the work that you do, it is not it's not designed for those who are actually going to be using it, but for it to be consumed visually by others, right? So we've tried to reduce that as much as possible. Of course, I wouldn't say that we're we're purists in that sense. I do fall into posting stories or posts or whatever of the work that we do, of the work in progress that we do, right? But we try to limit that as much as possible. In terms of the influence that gives us, you were asking, Arjen. Yes, it is inevitable, right? I think it's both a devil and but it's also I mean, it's a blessing and a curse, right? It allows at least myself to be aware of what's happening around me, right? There's of what others are doing, right? Mm-hmm. But you have to sort of keep yourself focused in knowing that even if you also consume too much information and too much references and too much design, to know that you have to sort of keep a certain focus on the work that you do, that not everything that you consume is something, it has a value for yourself, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. توضیحی که میده اینه که ما میخوایم که یعنی توی سوشال مدیا امروز ما میبینیم که یک عالمه تصویر درست میشه صرفا برای مصرف کردن، تصاویر زیاد، و ما جلوی این می‌خواستیم بیستیم، جلوی این جریان مصرفگرای تصویر بیش از حد، و خودمون هم سعی کردیم که خیلی کنترل شده این کار رو انجام بدیم و به همین دلیله که به نظر این مسئله مهمه. ولی در این حال این هم غیر قابل اجتنابه که ما تاثیر بگیریم از اون چیزی که میگذره و از اون مدیایی که به صورت روزمره دریافت میکنیم و اونم خودش رو نشون میده تو کار. Wonderful. Thanks for the explanation. Okay, more questions. So there is a question about, I don't know, this might be a broad question, but how do you explain the contemporary scene in architecture? Do you think there is a consensus on some specific strains of thought, or do you think there's a bunch of different things that is happening at the same time, this disciplinary dilemma or the confusion that everybody talks about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's been for many decades already that we no longer have sort of a singular train of thought or trend, and I love that, right? There are trends that are, well, I mean, what is a trend? Like maybe there are trends that are more popular on Instagram, but that doesn't mean that it has more value than another trend that could be happening on an offline sort of mode of communication, right? On a different country, in a different culture, maybe in a different region that is not accessible through sort of mass media, right? So I think that's there's no such thing as a trend, and I mean there's something tremendously Western about wanting to taxonomize and categorize different trends into boxes, right? And we've seen these exhibitions happening that try to group architects together in order to make sense of a group of work that has let's say, aesthetic or cultural sort of similarities, or maybe social or political similarities, right? And through that grouping of bodies of work, people are able to understand it not as isolated practices, but actually practices that are interconnected, right? And it's totally true, right? And we live in a completely sort of global communicated world in which we do not work in isolation, right? So we could perfectly sort of group the work of everyone into different categories if we wanted to, right? But that doesn't mean that that category is more relevant than another, right? If that category, let's say, is more broadcasted through certain media than others, right? It's just different ways of looking at the same problem, right? Which is solving a series of let's say, of issues through the lens of architecture, right?
Great, okay. در مورد این سوال کردم که نظرت راجع به این ترندهای مختلف، دسته‌بندی مختلف چیه در زمان معاصر؟ به نظرت آیا ما در یک جریان خاص مشخصی حاکمه یا اینکه یک تنوع و تکثری هست؟ میگه که مدت هاست که تو معماری تکثره و صرفا یک جریان یا سبکی غالب نیست و من اینو خیلی دوست دارم. به نظرم یک آزادی میده که آدم‌ها کارهای مختلف کنن. شاید یه وقتایی ما دوست داشته باشیم تو دانشگاه مثلا دسته‌بندی کنیم، شرکت‌های مختلف رو با هم گروپ کنیم و بخوایم نمایشگاه واسهشون بذاریم، سعی کنیم تاثیر اینا رو هم نشون بدیم، ولی این به این معنی نیست که این تنها اتفاقی که داره در فضای معماری میفته و در خیلی از جاها، خیلی کامیونیتی‌های مختلف ممکنه که اتفاقاتی بیفته، معماریای اتفاق بیفته که کاملا اینا از دید ما پنهان باشه ولی همزمان وجود دارن و نمیشه نفی کرد وجود اونها. Okay, there is another question about representation. I see that what you do is a lot of plans, not so many sections, and then a lot of beautiful, amazing photographs, but not so many renderings. And at least in the built work, I know that you also have renderings even on your website for some other body of works that you did before. But what's also your take on the representation today on contemporary representation? At one hand, we have these like hyper-realistic renderings that they kind of are narrating a sort of space in architecture, and we have some other more digital, more abstract way of representation and renderings. So how do you think about that in your practice?
I mean, again, I'd say that yes, there may be certain trends in terms of sort of visual representation in architecture, but again, those are sort of broadcasted through mass media, which doesn't make them for me more relevant than others. Yes, we do sort of curate very carefully the way that we communicate our projects, and I think communication is a sort of fundamental part of the practice of architecture, right? Because it's something that has to be understood by others, right? And the way that you explain your project has to tie back to the way to the mere concept of the project itself, right? Yes, we do work with a lot of plans. We understand the plan as the most sort of relevant drawing, because it allows us to understand the project within sort of its own organizational structure, the way that the project is used, the way that the project is sort of dwelled. It's almost like an X-ray for us of our work. In terms of the photographs, yes, we again, if the project it's all about a certain abstraction of means, then the photographs have to also be somehow abstract, right? So working with Luis Diaz, which is the photographer we always work with, it's fundamental, right? Because it's almost a collaboration. You hardly know where the limits of Luis and our work starts or ends, right? In terms of renders, yes, we also love renders, and we love hyperreal renders. It's again, yes, it probably belong to a certain so a certain group of architects that also use hyperreal renders. But it's why we didn't use them today. Again, for us, we love that limit of working with photographs that almost feel like renders, right? That certain almost irreal abstraction that the render gives is something that we also love. Was this too long? Should I unpack it?
This is good. No, I try to remember, and I'm sure a majority of our viewers, they understand English, but just I translate to make sure everybody understands something. در مورد بازنمایی ازش پرسیدم و اینکه شما خیلی پلان دارین تو کاراتون، با پلان خیلی علاقه دارین نشون دادن و خیلی عکس دارین از کاراتون، عکسای خیلی عالی گرفتین ولی از کار ساخته شده زیاد رندر نشون نمیدین و این چجوریه؟ آیا ولی از جهت یک سری کاراتون هست که ساخته نشده ولی رندراش هست روی سایت و نظرتون راجع به بازنمایی معماری معاصر چیه؟ گرایشتون چیه در شرکتی که دارین؟ و جواب اینه که آره خیلی به پلان علاقه دارم برای اینکه یک جوری اکستری مثل اکستری پروژه میمونه و میشه همه چیز پروژه رو توش فهمید، ولی در این حال عکس خیلی برای ما خوب کار کرده. ما حتی به عکس هم مثل همون رندر نگاه میکنیم به این دلیل که میتونیم اون ابسترکشنی که مد نظرمون هست تو رندر رو با همون مدیه عکس منتقل کنیم. با عکاس مشخص کار میکنیم در اسپانیا که خیلی راضی هستیم ازش و یک جور اون صحنه آرایی که میکنیم در عکسمون چیزی شبیه رندر و اون ما رو در واقع جایگزینمونه ولی همچنان به رندر هم علاقه داریم. I can. That's an interesting point about just the relationship between photography and rendering. In a lot of your images, it's hard to tell. Sometimes even it's not just your renderings looks like photographs. Sometimes your photographs look like rendering, and that's amazing. I like the images of the garden house, that the setting, the objects, everything is just, it's a rendering scene and you're not sure if it's a real picture or if it's a computer produced image, which is very interesting. But let me go, thank you so much. Let me go with the final question. I know it took so much time today of yours, but let me ask the last question that I see that there is a very clear social agenda and interest in your work, and also a very clear aesthetic agenda. And I am wondering, how do you relate to these two? Do you think the aesthetic agenda is a result of that, or do you look at them very separately? This ideology that you attach the conceptual framework of the practice to, does this also rule the aesthetic agenda, or do you think these are two different things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it goes both ways, right? I wouldn't be sort of egocentric enough to sort of just stick to one of them. I'd say that both. I'd say that we do personally have a certain aesthetic interest in a certain body of work, but also at the same time that body of work that we like and we produce and the references that we also consume belong to a series of architects that have similar conceptual preoccupations to ours, right? So in a way, it goes both ways, right? We look at references that have similar conceptual approaches, and that approach has a specific sort of aesthetic approach, right? So then by looking at those, we also look at their own conceptual approach, but we're also looking at their own aesthetic agenda. So it's almost like what came first, right? The chicken or the egg, and maybe maybe there is no interest in wanting to know what came first, but actually just acknowledging that both exist, right? That we're interested in both, that we're interested in and that they're both somehow tied, right? That there's no way of understanding sort of our, let's say, ideological agenda in the office. That's sort of the things that we believe in, the sort of architecture that we think should be produced. That would be represented through a different sort of aesthetic sort of presence, right? Those have to be hand in hand, right? So for me, there has to be a coherence, and that coherence is it's a two-way street, let's say, right? There's nothing sort of directional of I believe in something, therefore the production the result of it is this sort of aesthetic presence actually goes both ways, right? That aesthetic presence also produces a certain way of thinking, right?
Interesting. Okay, let me translate. سوال کردم ازش که شما در واقع یک رویکرد نظری یا تئوری خیلی مشخص دارین، دغدغه‌های اجتماعی دارید تو پروژه ها و همینطور یک رویکرد خیلی مشخص زیبایی شناسانه و خیلی دقیق. و آیا این دوتا رویکرد با هم مشخصاً مرتبطن؟ آیا اون رویکرد زیبایی شناسانه داره از اون رویکرد ایدئولوژیک میاد یا اینکه برعکسه یا اصلا بی ربطن اینا به هم؟ و توضیحی که میده میگه که سوال خوبیه و جوابش پیچیده است. میگه که این یک جور جاده دو طرفه است و یک جور مثل مسئله مرغ و تخم مرغ میمونه. خیلی ما نمیتونیم بگیم که اول اون دغدغه اجتماعی میاد یا اون زیبایی شناسیه. ما به هر دو علاقه داریم، همون دغدغه اجتماعی رو داریم در زندگیمون، در کارمون، و همون زیبایی شناسی وجود داره و یک رابطه رفت و برگشتی بین اینا هست و این دوتا هیچ کدوم حاصل دقیق اون یکی نیستش. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I think it was a wonderful lecture and I really enjoyed looking at the images, speaking your thoughts about those. I've only seen images before. I never heard you giving this lecture, so I think it's super interesting and I'm very grateful for joining us and accepting our invitation. And I'm sure that our audience has also enjoyed it a lot. Thank you, Edwardo.
Thank you, Arjen, and thank you everyone for inviting me. Thank you to the CAAI for the invitation, and please everyone keep in touch. DM on Instagram, email me, whatever. I'm happy to be there. So yeah, thanks, and hope to see you guys in person very soon.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.